The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets as James Wilson drove his well-maintained 1998 Buick home from his weekly Veterans Support Group meeting. At 72, James still sat tall behind the wheel, his posture reflecting the military bearing that had become second nature during his 30 years of Army service. The radio played softly, jazz from the local public station, as he mentally reviewed the meeting's discussion about helping younger vets find housing. James slowed as he approached the four-way stop at Maple and Oak, the same intersection he'd navigated thousands of times in the 23 years he'd lived in the neighborhood. He came to a full stop, checked all directions, and proceeded through. Half a block later, blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Now what could this be about? He muttered to himself, carefully signaling and pulling to the curb. James had never had so much as a parking ticket in this town. He switched off the radio, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, a habit his father had taught him long ago, and one he'd passed down to his own son and grandchildren. The officer took his time approaching, watching James through mirrored sunglasses despite the fading daylight. James noticed how the young officer's hand rested near his holster as he finally stepped up to the window. "License and registration," the officer demanded without preamble, his voice sharp. "Good afternoon, officer," James replied evenly. "May I ask what seems to be the problem?" The officer, whose nameplate read Parker, leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to the window. "You rolled through that stop back there. License and registration now," James nodded calmly. "I'll need to reach for my wallet, sir." "It's in my back pocket." Officer Parker made an impatient gesture. "Just hurry it up." With deliberate movements, James retrieved his wallet and then reached for the glove compartment for his registration. As he handed over the documents, he noticed Mrs. Henderson watering her front garden across the street, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. Officer Parker studied the license, looking between it and James with narrowed eyes. "Says here you live on Wellington Drive. Pretty nice neighborhood for—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air. "Yes, my late wife and I bought our home there in 1999, James replied, choosing to ignore the unfinished comment. "I've been a resident and taxpayer in this community for quite some time." Parker snorted. "Well, that doesn't put you above the law, does it? Wait here." As the officer returned to his patrol car, James exhaled slowly, his hand still resting on the wheel. Through his rearview mirror, he could see Officer Parker speaking into his radio, gesturing occasionally toward the Buick. More than 5 minutes passed before the officer returned, but he didn't bring James's license back. "Step out of the car, please." James blinked in surprise. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer? I was under the impression this was a routine traffic stop." "I don't like your attitude," Parker said, his voice hardening. "When an officer gives you an instruction, you follow it. Now step out of the vehicle." Weighing his options carefully, James unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. His left knee ached as he stood, an old injury from his second tour in Vietnam, but he straightened to his full height of 6'1", still impressive despite the slight stoop of age. "Stand by the front of your vehicle," Parker instructed, pointing with his pen. James complied, aware that Mrs. Henderson had stopped pretending to water her plants and was now openly watching. A second car slowed as it passed, the driver craning his neck to observe the scene. "You always drive through stop signs in this neighborhood?" Parker asked, circling James like a shark. "No, sir. And with all due respect, I did come to a complete stop at that intersection." Parker laughed, a short, harsh sound. "That's what they all say. You people always think the rules don't apply to you." The phrase "you people" landed like a slap. James had heard those words many times before. In school in the 1950s, during basic training in the 1970s, and now in 2025, from a police officer young enough to be his grandson. "Officer," James said quietly, "I've spent most of my life following rules. 30 years in the United States Army taught me a great deal about respecting authority." Parker stopped his circling. "You expect me to believe you were in the Army for 30 years? "Colonel James Wilson retired," James confirmed, keeping his voice steady. 82nd Airborne, then Special Forces, finally Pentagon staff before retirement. "Right," Parker drawled, dragging out the word. "And I'm the Secretary of Defense. Let's try again. Where were you coming from before you decided to ignore that stop sign?" James felt a flash of anger but pushed it down, drawing on decades of discipline. I was at the Veteran Support Alliance meeting at the community center. We meet every Tuesday at 4. Got any proof of that? Or this supposed military career? My military ID is in my wallet, which you currently have, James pointed out. And there were about 20 other veterans at today's meeting who could confirm my attendance. Parker's radio crackled and he stepped away to respond, speaking in low tones. When he returned, his demeanor had shifted subtly. Your record's clean, he said, sounding almost disappointed, but I still need to search your vehicle. On what grounds? James asked, his patience beginning to wear thin. I have reason to suspect there may be contraband in the vehicle, Parker replied vaguely. That's simply not true, James said. I do not consent to a search without probable cause. Parker stepped closer, invading James's personal space. Listen here, old man. I can make this very difficult for you. I can have your car impounded, make you walk home. How's that bum knee going to like that? Or you can cooperate and maybe I'll just write you a warning for the stop sign. James felt his heart rate increase, not from fear, but from a deep, burning indignation. In that moment, he wasn't Colonel Wilson, who had commanded hundreds of troops in combat zones, or James, who volunteered at the local elementary school teaching chess. He was just another black man being harassed by a cop who'd already decided who and what he was. Fine, he said at last, but I want it noted that I'm agreeing under duress. Noted, Parker said with mock formality, making an exaggerated gesture toward the Buick. Now stand right there where I can see you. James watched as Parker began searching his car, opening the glove compartment and roughly shuffling through the neatly organized papers inside. The officer moved to the back seat where he carelessly tossed aside a garment bag containing James's dress uniform, which he'd taken to be cleaned after the military funeral he'd attended last weekend. When Parker reached under the passenger seat and pulled out a polished wooden box, James stepped forward instinctively. Please be careful with that. What did I tell you about staying put? Parker snapped, flipping open the box to reveal James's service medals, including a silver star and 3 purple hearts, nestled in velvet. What are these supposed to be? Those are my military decorations, James said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Earned over 3 decades of service to this country. Parker snorted, closing the box and tossing it carelessly onto the seat. Sure they are. Probably bought them at some army surplus store. A car slowed nearby, and James recognized the town's new library director, Dr. Watterson, looking concerned as she passed. He gave her a small nod, trying to communicate that he was all right, though the humiliation of standing helplessly while a stranger ransacked his possessions burned through him. After what seemed like an eternity, Parker emerged from the car empty-handed. Nothing this time, he said, as if disappointed. But I've got my eye on you now. This is a nice quiet town. We like to keep it that way. James stood silently, understanding the implied threat. This wasn't about a stop sign. This was about belonging, about who had the right to live where, drive what, and expect respect. Parker finally handed back James's license and registration, along with a written warning for the alleged traffic violation. Consider this your lucky day. Is there anything else, officer? James asked, his dignity intact despite everything. Yeah. Drive more carefully in the future, Parker said, his tone making it clear he meant more than just observing traffic laws. And remember, I patrol this area regularly. As Officer Parker returned to his patrol car, James remained standing by his Buick, letting the tension drain from his body. Only when the police cruiser disappeared around the corner did he slowly get back into his car. Inside, he found his possessions scattered, the wooden metal box upside down on the floor, his service uniform partially unfolded on the back seat. With careful movements, he began restoring order, placing each item back where it belonged, just as he'd tried to maintain order in his life, despite the chaos the world sometimes thrust upon him. James sat motionless behind the wheel for several minutes, processing what had just happened. In his mind, he composed and discarded a dozen letters to the police chief, the mayor, the local paper. Instead, he simply started the engine and drove the remaining 3 blocks home, where framed photographs of his late wife, their children, and grandchildren waited to remind him of all he had built despite a world that had never made it easy. What he didn't know, as he pulled into his driveway, was that someone important had witnessed the end of his encounter with Officer Parker. Someone who would ensure this wasn't the end of the story. James pulled into his driveway, switching off the engine with a shaky hand. The encounter with Officer Parker had left him more rattled than he wanted to admit. For a moment he just sat there, the silence of the car wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The two-story colonial home before him had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades. He and Louise had chosen it together, saving for years to afford a house in this neighborhood with good schools for their children. Now, with Louise gone 3 years and the kids grown with families of their own, the house sometimes felt too large. But today, he was grateful for the privacy it would provide. James gathered his scattered belongings and made his way to the front door. Inside, he set his keys in the ceramic dish Louise had made in a pottery class they'd taken together for their 40th anniversary. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but the residue of humiliation clung to him like an unpleasant odor. He carried the wooden metal box to his study and placed it carefully on his desk. Opening it, he arranged each medal in its proper place: the silver star, the bronze star, the purple hearts, the service medals from Vietnam and the Gulf War. Each one represented not just personal achievement, but the men and women he'd served with, some who never made it home. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his daughter Michelle calling for their regular Tuesday check-in. "Hey, Dad." Her warm voice came through the speaker. "How was the veterans meeting today?" James hesitated. Should he tell her about what happened? Michelle was a lawyer in the state attorney's office, and he knew exactly how she'd react, with righteous fury and immediate action. Part of him wanted that, wanted to unleash his daughter's considerable talents against Officer Parker and the department that employed him. But another part, the part that had navigated a long military career as a black man in America, counseled caution. "Dad, you there?" "Yes, sweetheart." The meeting was fine. Just the usual discussions about helping the younger vets with housing and job placement. "You sound off." "Everything okay?" James smiled slightly. Michelle had always been perceptive, even as a child. "Just tired, that's all." "How are the kids?" He let her talk about his grandchildren, Zoe's science project, and Tyler's basketball tournament, grateful for the distraction. By the time they hung up, he'd almost convinced himself the incident with Parker wasn't worth mentioning. Almost. That night, sleep eluded James. He kept replaying the encounter in his mind, thinking of all the things he should have said or done. By dawn, he was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee. A legal pad before him, he began to write, documenting every detail of the interaction while it was still fresh in his memory. The officer's words, his own responses, the witnesses who had driven by. If nothing else, he would have a record. The doorbell rang at 8:30, surprising him. He wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, he saw Dr. Watterson, the library director who had driven past during his encounter with Officer Parker. "Dr. Wilson," she said when he opened the door. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, Dr. Watterson. Please come in." He led her to the living room, offering coffee, which she accepted. They had met several times at community events and fundraisers, and James occasionally volunteered for the library's Veterans Oral History Project. "I wanted to check on you," she said directly once they were seated. "What I witnessed yesterday was disturbing." James nodded, appreciating her candor. "It wasn't my finest hour." "It wasn't the officer's finest hour," she corrected firmly. "I only caught the end of it, but what I saw was a clear abuse of authority." "These things happen," James said, the old instinct to minimize, to not make waves, asserting itself. Dr. Watterson set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "They shouldn't happen, especially not in our community, and especially not to someone of your standing." "My standing shouldn't matter," James pointed out quietly. "It shouldn't happen to anyone." "You're absolutely right," she agreed. "Which is why I called Chief Martinez this morning." James sat up straighter. "You did what?" "I called the police chief. I've known Gloria for years. We serve on the City Arts Commission together. I told her what I saw, and she was concerned, to put it mildly." A mix of emotions washed over James. Gratitude that someone had witnessed the incident and taken action, discomfort at being the center of attention, and a flicker of hope that perhaps something would actually be done. "She'd like to speak with you," Dr. Watterson continued. "Officially or unofficially, whatever you prefer." James looked down at the legal pad where he'd been documenting the incident. "I'll think about it." After Dr. Watterson left, promising to keep him updated, James sat alone in his living room, considering his options. Part of him wanted to let it go, to chalk it up as just another indignity in a lifetime that had seen far worse. But another part, the part that had fought for his country and believed in its highest ideals even when it fell short, knew that silence solved nothing. His phone rang again. This time it was Richard Thompson, his longtime friend and fellow veteran from the support group. "James, what the hell happened yesterday? Mrs. Henderson called my wife this morning. Said she saw you getting hassled by some cop on your way home." James sighed. Small towns had their advantages, but privacy wasn't one of them. "It was nothing, Rich, just a misunderstanding." "Bullshit," Richard replied bluntly. "Henderson said the guy had you standing outside your car for 20 minutes while he tore through it." "That's not a misunderstanding." Over the next hour, James found himself telling Richard everything, from the alleged traffic violation to Parker's thinly veiled racist comments and rough handling of his medals. "You need to file a complaint," Richard said when James finished. "That's textbook harassment." "And then what?" James asked. "Best case scenario, the guy gets a slap on the wrist. Worst case, nothing happens and I've made an enemy of someone with a badge and a gun who patrols my neighborhood." "So you're just going to let it go? That doesn't sound like the James Wilson I served with." The comment stung because it was true. In his military career, James had never hesitated to stand up against injustice, even when it cost him. He had filed reports against superior officers who abused their authority, had testified in court-martials against men he'd once called friends when they'd crossed the line. Why was this different? Because he was tired. Because at 72, he had hoped to be past fighting these battles. Because each one took a piece of him he wasn't sure he could spare anymore. "I'll think about it," he told Richard, the same thing he'd told Dr. Watterson. After hanging up, James showered and dressed with his usual military precision. He had planned to spend the day working in his garden, but instead, he found himself driving to the community center where the Veteran Support Alliance had their small office. The alliance had started as an informal support group, but had grown over the years to become an advocacy organization for veterans in the county. They helped with everything from VA paperwork to housing assistance to mental health referrals. Anthony Rivera, the alliance's coordinator and a Gulf War veteran himself, looked up in surprise when James walked in. "Colonel, didn't expect to see you back so soon after yesterday's meeting." James settled into the chair across from Anthony's desk. "I need some advice, Tony." He explained the situation once more, the retelling no easier the third time around. Anthony listened without interrupting, his expression darkening as the story unfolded. "We've had other complaints about this, Parker," he said when James finished. "Nothing as blatant as what you experienced, but enough to suggest a pattern." "Other veterans?" Anthony nodded. "2 in the last month. Both younger guys, both men of color. One was Thomas Walker. You know him from the group, served in Afghanistan. The other was a new guy, just moved to town, Iraq vet with some PTSD issues. Parker stopped them both for suspicious behavior, and which apparently means being black or brown in the wrong neighborhood. The knowledge that he wasn't alone in this experience should have been comforting, but instead it filled James with a renewed sense of responsibility. If this officer was systematically targeting veterans of color, someone needed to stand up. What did they do about it? James asked. "Nothing," Anthony admitted. "They were both worried about retaliation. You know how it is. When you've got PTSD or other issues, the last thing you want is trouble with local law enforcement." James did know. Many of the younger vets in their group struggled with authority figures after their service experiences, especially those with trauma. A confrontational police officer could trigger all sorts of reactions, potentially leading to dangerous situations. "Chief Martinez called me this morning," James said finally. "Dr. Watterson from the library witnessed part of what happened and reported it." Anthony raised his eyebrows. "Gloria Martinez is good people. Her brother served in Desert Storm. She gets it." "What are you going to tell her?" James looked out the window at the American flag flying in front of the community center, thinking about what that flag had meant to him throughout his life. The promise it held, often unfulfilled but always worth fighting for. "I'm going to tell her the truth," he decided. "Not just for me, but for Thomas and that new guy and anyone else this officer might harass in the future." Anthony reached across the desk to clasp James's shoulder. That's why you were a good commander, Colonel. You never forgot who you were fighting for. As James left the community center, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was Chief Martinez, asking if he could come to the station tomorrow morning to discuss the incident with Officer Parker. She added that she would understand if he preferred to meet somewhere else. James typed his reply carefully. I'll be there at 9 a.m. Thank you for taking this seriously. As he drove home, James felt a strange mix of dread and determination. He had spent his life in service to his country, to his troops, to his community. Tomorrow would be no different. Not a vendetta, not a crusade, just another day of standing up for what was right. What he didn't know was that Officer Parker was currently being called into Chief Martinez's office, and that their conversation would change the course of events in ways James couldn't imagine. The police station was a modern brick building with large windows and a flagpole out front. James had driven past it countless times but had never had reason to enter. Now, as he parked his car in the visitor's spot, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had accompanied every significant confrontation in his life. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. He had deliberately chosen to wear a navy blazer with his veteran's pins on the lapel, gray slacks, and a crisp white shirt. Not his uniform, that would have been too much, but an outfit that quietly commanded respect. Inside, the receptionist greeted him with professional courtesy. Colonel Wilson, Chief Martinez is expecting you. Please follow me. The title caught him by surprise. He hadn't mentioned his rank when making the appointment. Chief Gloria Martinez met him at her office door, extending her hand. She was shorter than James had expected, perhaps 5'4", but her handshake was firm and her gaze direct. Colonel Wilson, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat. Her office was orderly but not austere. Family photos on the desk, degrees and certifications on one wall, and a large map of the town on another. James noticed a framed photo of a young man in marine dress blues. My brother, Chief Martinez said, following his gaze. He served in the First Gulf War. That's why your name was immediately familiar to me when Dr. Watterson called. James looked at her questioningly. You don't remember him, do you? She smiled slightly. Carlos Martinez. He was a lance corporal when his unit was pinned down outside Kuwait City. You were the colonel who called in air support that got them out. James's mind traveled back through the decades. There had been so many operations, so many young men and women under his command or adjacent to it. I'm sorry, I don't recall the specific incident, he admitted. He does, she said simply. He has that photo of you visiting the wounded at the field hospital afterward. You gave him your card and told him to call if he ever needed anything. A vague memory stirred. Did he? Call, I mean. Chief Martinez nodded. Years later, when he was struggling with what we now know was PTSD, you helped him get into a treatment program that the VA wasn't offering yet. The memory solidified. Carlos, of course. He wanted to go to college afterward. Engineering, if I remember correctly. Civil engineering. He designs bridges now. She gestured to another photo, this one of a smiling man in his 50s standing beside a large concrete structure, which makes what happened to you yesterday all the more disturbing to me, both personally and professionally. She opened a folder on her desk. I've reviewed Officer Parker's body camera footage, Dr. Watterson's statement, and the statement from Mrs. Henderson across the street. Before we discuss specific actions, I'd like to hear your account of what happened. James had prepared for this, rehearsing the facts without emotion as he would have for any military debriefing. He recounted the stop, the officer's behavior, the search of his car, and the veiled threats, keeping his voice steady and factual. Chief Martinez took notes as he spoke, occasionally asking for clarification, but never interrupting his narrative. When he finished, she set down her pen and looked at him directly. Colonel Wilson, on behalf of this department, I want to apologize for Officer Parker's conduct. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and contrary to our policies and training. James nodded, accepting the apology but waiting for what would come next. In his experience, institutional apologies were often followed by justifications or minimizations. Instead, Chief Martinez surprised him. I'd like to show you something with your permission. She turned her computer monitor so he could see it and played a video file. It was the body camera footage from his encounter with Officer Parker, starting from the moment the patrol car pulled up behind his Buick. Watching the scene unfold from this perspective was surreal. James saw himself responding with a calm dignity that had felt far less certain in the moment. He heard Parker's tone more clearly now, the contempt barely disguised beneath a veneer of official procedure. When Parker tossed the metal box onto the seat, James flinched involuntarily. Chief Martinez paused the video. "This isn't Officer Parker's first incident," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "But I believe it will be his last, at least in this department." She turned the monitor back and closed the file. "I've scheduled a disciplinary hearing for Friday. Based on this evidence and previous complaints in his file, I'm recommending termination." James hadn't expected such a definitive response. In his experience, police departments often closed ranks around their officers. "You seem surprised," Chief Martinez observed. "I am," James admitted. "I thought perhaps there would be more resistance to addressing the issue." She leaned forward slightly. "Colonel, I've been working to change the culture of this department since I became chief 3 years ago. We've implemented new training, community engagement initiatives, and stricter accountability measures. But cultural change is slow, and some officers like Parker resisted." She gestured to the folder. "This incident, as unfortunate as it was, provides clear evidence of behavior we cannot tolerate if we want to maintain the community's trust." As they continued talking, James learned that Parker had been with the department for 4 years, transferred from a larger city after what Chief Martinez described as issues with his previous department. He had received multiple verbal warnings about his aggressive approach, particularly in minority neighborhoods, but had never faced formal discipline due to a lack of concrete evidence or complaints. "People are often reluctant to file official complaints," Chief Martinez explained, "especially those from marginalized communities who may have had negative experiences with law enforcement in the past." James understood this reality all too well. "What happens now?" "That depends partly on you," she said. "I'm proceeding with the disciplinary action regardless, but a formal statement from you would strengthen the case significantly. However, I understand if you prefer not to get involved further." James considered his options. He had come here intending simply to report what happened, not to pursue any particular outcome. The prospect of becoming central to an officer's termination proceedings was uncomfortable, even if that officer had treated him poorly. "May I think about it?" he asked finally. "Of course. The hearing is on Friday at 2 p.m. If you decide to participate, we can take your formal statement any time before then." As James prepared to leave, there was a knock at the door. Chief Martinez's expression tightened slightly as she called, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Officer Parker. He stepped into the office, then froze when he saw James sitting there. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" Parker's voice had lost the aggressive edge it had carried during their encounter, replaced by a wariness that seemed out of character. "Yes, Officer Parker. Please wait outside until Colonel Wilson and I have concluded our meeting." The emphasis on Colonel wasn't subtle, nor was the flash of realization that crossed Parker's face as he processed the information. Without another word, he stepped back and closed the door. "I apologize for the interruption," Chief Martinez said. "I didn't schedule his meeting to overlap with yours." James stood up, straightening his blazer. "It's all right. Perhaps it's better this way. We've seen each other now in a different context." As he walked toward the door, Chief Martinez said, "Colonel Wilson, regardless of what you decide about the statement, I hope you'll consider another request. We're revising our community policing training program, and having someone of your experience provide insight would be invaluable." The request caught James off guard. "I'm not sure what I could contribute." "A perspective we desperately need," she replied simply. "Think about it, please." In the hallway, James found himself face to face with Officer Parker, who was sitting on a bench outside the chief's office. The younger man stood up immediately, his posture stiff. For a moment, neither spoke. James studied Parker's face, younger than he'd realized during their encounter, perhaps early 30s, with a tension around his eyes that hadn't been visible behind the mirrored sunglasses. "Colonel Wilson," Parker said finally, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "I didn't realize that I was a colonel," James finished for him, "or that I was a person deserving of basic respect." Parker had no answer for that. His gaze dropped to the veteran's pins on James's lapel, lingering on the combat infantry badge. "My father was in Vietnam," he said suddenly, as if the words had escaped without permission. He never talked about it. James wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected personal disclosure. Many didn't, he said finally. An awkward silence fell between them. James could have walked away then, left Parker to whatever reckoning awaited him in the chief's office. But something made him stay, perhaps the same instinct that had made him a good commander, the ability to see potential where others saw only failure. The thing about service, James said carefully, is that it teaches you the difference between authority and respect. One is given with a rank or a badge. The other has to be earned every day with every interaction. Parker's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I don't know what will happen in your meeting with the chief. James continued, but I do know that yesterday wasn't your finest hour. The question is whether it defines you moving forward. With that, James nodded a brief goodbye and walked down the hallway toward the exit, feeling Parker's eyes on his back. He wasn't sure if his words had made any impact, but he had said what needed to be said. Outside, the morning sun was bright, the air crisp with early fall. James sat in his car for a long moment, processing the unexpected turns the morning had taken. Chief Martinez's support had been a pleasant surprise, as had her personal connection to his military service. The chance encounter with Parker had been, he wasn't sure what it had been. Not closure, certainly. Perhaps a beginning of something else. His phone buzzed with a text from Michelle. How did it go at the station? James started the car before replying, better than expected. Tell you more tonight. As he drove home, James thought about Chief Martinez's second request to help with the police department's community training. The idea of working with the very institution that had humiliated him just days ago seemed paradoxical. Yet if there was a chance to prevent similar incidents in the future, didn't he have a responsibility to try? The question followed him home, where he found an unexpected visitor waiting on his porch. Anthony Rivera from the Veterans Alliance. Looking unusually serious, Colonel? Anthony called as James got out of his car. We need to talk. Thomas Walker just had another run-in with Officer Parker this morning, and this time things escalated. James felt his stomach tighten at Anthony's words. What happened? Is Thomas okay? Anthony's expression was grim. Physically, yes, mentally. He shook his head. Let's talk inside. Once seated in James's living room, Anthony explained the situation. Thomas Walker, a 34-year-old Afghanistan veteran who attended their support group, had been stopped by Officer Parker while walking his dog near the park. What began as questioning about a reported disturbance in the area quickly escalated when Thomas questioned why he was being singled out. Parker got in his face, started throwing around accusations about resisting, threatened to arrest him right there on the sidewalk, Anthony said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Thomas has PTSD, Colonel. Being confronted like that triggered him badly. Did Parker know that? James asked. Thomas was wearing his veteran's cap with his unit insignia, and he tried to tell Parker about his condition, tried to explain why he needed some space. Anthony rubbed his face tiredly. Witnesses say Parker just kept pushing, getting closer, demanding ID, putting his hand on his taser. James closed his eyes briefly, imagining the scene. How did it end? Thankfully, another officer arrived. Rodriguez, I think his name is. Younger guy. He recognized Thomas from a veterans event at the community center and stepped in, calmed things down. Got Parker to back off. James thought about his meeting with Chief Martinez just hours earlier, her assertion that Parker's behavior was being addressed. Clearly, the officer hadn't taken the warning to heart. Where is Thomas now? At the VA hospital. Not admitted, just talking to his counselor. His wife took him. Anthony leaned forward. Colonel, this isn't just about you anymore, or even just about Thomas. How many other vets in this town is this guy going to harass? How many kids in the neighborhood? We need to do something. James stood and walked to the window, looking out at his quiet street, the same street where just 2 days ago, he'd been made to feel like an intruder in his own community. I just came from meeting with Chief Martinez, he said. She's already scheduling a disciplinary hearing for Parker on Friday. She was going to recommend termination based on my incident and previous complaints. Anthony's eyebrows rose. That's unexpected. Usually these things get swept under the rug. Martinez is different, James replied. Her brother served. She understands what's at stake. He turned back to face Anthony. This incident with Thomas might be the final nail in Parker's coffin. Or it might not, Anthony countered. You know how these things go. Without formal complaints, without people willing to stand up and be counted, officers like Parker just move to another department and continue the same behavior. James knew he was right. He'd seen it during his military career. Problem officers transferred rather than disciplined, troubling patterns of behavior ignored until they couldn't be anymore. "What are you suggesting?" "A unified front," Anthony said simply. "You, me, Thomas when he's ready, and any other vets who've had run-ins with Parker. We go to the disciplinary hearing together, present a pattern of behavior that can't be dismissed." The idea made sense, but James still hesitated. He had lived his life by the code of handling problems through proper channels, following the chain of command. Street protests and public confrontations had never been his style. Reading his expression, Anthony added, "This isn't about making a scene, Colonel. It's about showing the department and the community that veterans stand together, that we've got each other's backs just like we did in uniform." Put that way, James couldn't argue. "Let me make some calls," he said. Over the next 2 days, James became the unexpected center of a growing movement. Word spread through the Veterans Alliance network about Parker's pattern of harassment. 3 more veterans came forward with stories similar to James's and Thomas's, routine stops that became confrontational, disrespect for their service, thinly veiled racial comments. Dr. Watterson from the library connected James with the head of the town's Civil Rights Commission. Mrs. Henderson, his neighbor who had witnessed his encounter with Parker, turned out to be a retired school principal with considerable influence in the community. She organized a letter-writing campaign to the mayor and town council. By Thursday evening, what had begun as a personal incident had transformed into a community conversation about policing, respect, and the treatment of veterans and minorities. James's phone rang constantly. His daughter Michelle drove up from the city to help him manage the sudden attention, fielding calls and organizing the growing list of people who wanted to attend Friday's hearing. "Dad, this is bigger than just Officer Parker now," Michelle said as they sat at his kitchen table Thursday night, surrounded by notes and lists. "People are talking about systemic issues in the department, about community oversight, about training reforms." James rubbed his tired eyes. "That wasn't my intention. I just wanted to report what happened." Michelle squeezed his hand. "I know, but sometimes being a leader means the mission finds you, not the other way around." It was something he used to tell his officers during his military career, and hearing his own words reflected back to him made James smile despite his fatigue. "Chief Martinez asked me to help with their community policing training," he admitted. "I wasn't sure about it at the time, but now, it's the perfect next step," Michelle finished for him. "Using what happened to create positive change." James nodded slowly. "Maybe. Let's get through tomorrow first." Friday dawned clear and cool. James dressed with his usual care, suit, tie, polished shoes. Michelle had suggested he wear his full dress uniform, but he had declined. This wasn't about intimidation or pulling rank. It was about dignity, about being heard. The police station parking lot was fuller than it had been during his previous visit. Veterans from the Alliance had arrived early, many wearing caps or jackets identifying their service branches. Community members stood in small groups talking quietly. Local news vans were parked along the street. Anthony met James at his car. "Quite a turnout," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "Too much," James worried. This was supposed to be a disciplinary hearing, not a public demonstration. "The hearing is still private," Anthony assured him. But people wanted to show support. Show the department that the community is watching. Inside, the station was busy but orderly. Chief Martinez had arranged for the hearing to take place in the larger community room, rather than the usual conference space, anticipating the number of people who would be giving statements. James, Thomas Walker, and the other veterans who had come forward were seated at a table facing the disciplinary committee. Chief Martinez, the deputy chief, and a civilian representative from the town council. Officer Parker sat at another table with a union representative. When James entered the room, Parker looked up briefly, then away. The officer appeared tense, his usual swagger replaced by a rigid posture that spoke of defensive anger rather than remorse. Chief Martinez called the hearing to order with a brief explanation of the process. Each complainant would give their statement, followed by questions from the committee. Officer Parker would have the opportunity to respond, after which the committee would deliberate. James went first, recounting his experience clearly and factually. The body camera footage was played, causing a visible reaction from the committee members who hadn't previously viewed it. When asked if he had anything to add, James spoke about the impact. Not just the momentary humiliation, but the deeper sense of being viewed as suspicious in his own community. Thomas followed, his voice occasionally wavering as he described his encounter. The contrast between his obvious vulnerability and Parker's aggressive approach was stark. Two other veterans gave similar accounts, each one adding to the picture of an officer who consistently misused his authority. Throughout the statements, Parker sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering to his representative. When it was finally his turn to respond, he stood stiffly. "I was doing my job," he began, his voice defensive. "Ensuring community safety means being vigilant about suspicious behavior," the civilian representative interrupted. "Could you clarify what was suspicious about Colonel Wilson stopping fully at a stop sign? Or Mr. Walker walking his dog in a public park?" Parker faltered momentarily. "It's about context. Patterns of behavior that officers are trained to recognize. And those patterns coincidentally apply to black and brown veterans in residential neighborhoods," the representative pressed. As Parker struggled to justify his actions without explicitly admitting to racial profiling, James watched him closely. He saw not a monster but a man whose worldview was being publicly challenged, whose certainties were crumbling under scrutiny. When the responses concluded, Chief Martinez announced that the committee would deliberate privately. The room cleared, with most people moving to the lobby or outside to wait for the decision. James found a quiet corner, needing a moment away from the intensity of the hearing. He was surprised when Thomas Walker approached him. "Colonel Wilson," Thomas said hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you for starting this. For a long time I thought it was just me, that maybe I was doing something to attract negative attention." James nodded in understanding. "It's never just you. That's what they want you to think, that you're alone, that your experience isn't real or valid." "My grandfather was in Vietnam," Thomas said. "He used to tell me stories about how it was back then for black soldiers. I thought things had changed more than they have." "They have changed," James assured him. "Not enough and not everywhere, but enough that we're in that room today instead of suffering in silence." Their conversation was interrupted by Chief Martinez's assistant announcing that the committee had reached a decision. Everyone filed back into the community room, the atmosphere tense with anticipation. Chief Martinez's expression was unreadable as she delivered the verdict. Officer Parker would be terminated, effective immediately, with the findings forwarded to the State Licensing Board for Law Enforcement Officers. A mixture of reactions rippled through the room. Relief, vindication, and from Parker, a flash of shock quickly masked by anger. He stood abruptly, ignoring his representative's attempt to calm him, and walked out without a word. As the room gradually emptied, Chief Martinez approached James. "Thank you for your courage in coming forward, Colonel. This outcome wouldn't have been possible without your leadership." James shook his head slightly. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who spoke up, everyone who decided enough was enough." She smiled tiredly. "True leadership is often about creating the conditions for others to find their voices." She paused. "My offer still stands about helping with our training program. In fact, it's more important now than ever." Before James could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Michelle. "Dad, come outside. You need to see this." Curious and slightly concerned, James made his way through the station and out the front doors. What he found there stopped him in his tracks. The parking lot had filled with people, veterans, neighbors, community members of all ages and backgrounds. Someone had erected a small podium, and Anthony Rivera was speaking into a microphone about the importance of accountability and respect. When the crowd spotted James, a spontaneous applause broke out. Michelle appeared at his side, beaming with pride. "They're calling it the Respect Initiative," she told him. "They want to build on today's outcome, create a permanent community oversight committee for the police department, develop new training protocols." James watched the scene with mixed emotions, pride in what had been accomplished, hope for what might come next, but also a weariness at the thought of more meetings, more conflict, more work to be done. Michelle seemed to read his thoughts. "You don't have to lead this, Dad. You've done your part. Others can carry it forward." As if on cue, Thomas Walker stepped up to the microphone. speaking confidently about his experiences and his vision for change. Watching him, James felt something shift inside, a passing of the torch perhaps from one generation of veterans to the next. "Maybe I'll just consult," he said to Michelle with a small smile. "Share some wisdom from the sidelines." But as the crowd noticed him and called for him to speak, James knew the story wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done, bridges to be built, understanding to be fostered, and perhaps, just perhaps, he still had something to contribute to that mission. 3 months had passed since the disciplinary hearing. Winter had settled over the town, bringing short days and long nights. James stood at his living room window, watching snow fall gently on his front yard. The Christmas lights he'd put up with Michelle's help during her last visit twinkled softly, reflecting off the white ground. His phone buzzed on the side table. It was a text from Thomas Walker. "All set for tomorrow. Full house expected." James smiled slightly. Tomorrow marked the first official training session of the new community policing program that had grown out of the Parker incident. What had begun as a personal humiliation had evolved into something neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The weeks following Parker's termination had been busy. The Respect Initiative, as people called it, had gained momentum throughout the community. The mayor, sensing the political winds, had quickly established a civilian oversight committee for the police department. Chief Martinez had embraced the opportunity, working closely with the Veterans Alliance and other community groups to develop new training protocols. James had found himself in an unexpected role. Not quite leader, not quite consultant, but something in between. A bridge between different parts of the community, between generations of veterans, between citizens and law enforcement. His doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. When he opened the door, he found Richard Thompson on his porch, bundled against the cold. "Ready for your big day tomorrow, Colonel?" Richard asked as James ushered him inside. "As ready as I'll ever be," James replied, taking his friend's coat. "Coffee?" In the kitchen, Richard settled at the table while James prepared their drinks. Their Tuesday veterans meetings had evolved into more frequent gatherings at James's house, planning sessions for the initiative that often stretched late into the evening. "Heard anything from Parker?" Richard asked, accepting the steaming mug James handed him. James shook his head. "Not directly. Chief Martinez mentioned he's moved to his sister's place in Ohio, looking for work outside of law enforcement, apparently." The news of Parker's termination had made the local paper. There had been some pushback from the police union initially, but the evidence had been too clear, the pattern too established to defend. The broader conversation about policing in the community had continued, sometimes heated but largely productive. "Still feel bad for him?" Richard asked, knowing his friend's complicated feelings about the outcome. James considered the question. Not about the termination. That was necessary. But about the man himself. He paused. "Everyone has a story, Rich. Everyone has reasons they became who they are. Understanding that doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps make sense of them." Richard chuckled. "Always the commander looking at the big picture." "Speaking of the big picture," James said, changing the subject, "how are the renovations coming at the new center?" The Veterans Alliance had recently acquired a larger space downtown, expanding their services to include legal assistance, job placement, and mental health resources. The Parker incident had brought unexpected attention and funding to veterans' issues in the community. "On schedule for the grand opening next month," Richard reported. "Thomas has been there every day overseeing the contractors. Kids found his calling?" James nodded, pleased. Thomas Walker had emerged as a natural leader in the aftermath of the hearing, channeling his own difficult experience into advocacy for other veterans. The transformation had been remarkable, from a young man struggling with PTSD and isolation to a confident community organizer. "And the police academy?" Richard asked. "First-class graduates in June," James replied. "Chief Martinez implemented all our recommendations for the curriculum: cultural competency, de-escalation, mental health awareness, plus a full day with veterans talking about their experiences." The doorbell rang again. This time it was Anthony Rivera, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. "Sorry I'm late," he said as James let him in. "Had to finish the presentation for tomorrow." Soon James's living room filled with familiar faces. Dr. Watterson from the library, Mrs. Henderson from across the street, Thomas Walker and 2 other younger veterans. The final planning meeting for tomorrow's training session had become something of a social gathering as well, with Michelle sending cookies from the city and everyone bringing their own contributions. As James looked around at the diverse group in his living room, different ages, backgrounds, and experiences united by a common purpose, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened with Parker, but for what had grown from it. The meeting wound down around 9, with everyone clear on their roles for tomorrow. As the others left, Thomas lingered behind. "Colonel, got a minute?" he asked, his expression serious. "Of course," James replied, leading him back to the living room. "Everything all right?" Thomas sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped between his knees. "I got a message yesterday. From Parker." James raised his eyebrows in surprise. What did he want? "To apologize," Thomas said, still sounding bewildered by it. "Said he's been doing a lot of thinking these past months. Said he started counseling, trying to understand why he acted the way he did." James absorbed this unexpected information. "Do you believe him?" Thomas shrugged. "Hard to say. But he mentioned something that stuck with me. Said his father came back from Vietnam a different man. Angry, drinking, taking it out on the family. Said he grew up thinking all vets were ticking time bombs. That explains some of his hostility," James murmured, "though it doesn't excuse it." "That's what I told him," Thomas agreed. "But then I got thinking about tomorrow's training, about what we're trying to accomplish. And I wondered if—" He hesitated. "If he should be part of it?" James finished for him. Thomas nodded. "Not tomorrow. It's too soon. But eventually." A voice saying, "I got it wrong, and here's why." Could be powerful. James considered the idea. It was unexpected, but not without merit. Real change required difficult conversations, required people to confront their biases and mistakes. Perhaps Parker's journey could eventually become part of the larger story they were trying to tell. "Let's table it for now," James suggested. "Focus on tomorrow, but keep the door open for the future." After Thomas left, James sat alone in his quiet house, thinking about the winding path that had led to this moment. From a routine traffic stop to a community transformation, from humiliation to purpose. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Chief Martinez. "Just reviewed your presentation materials. Excellent work. The department is lucky to have your insight." James smiled slightly. The presentation for tomorrow was something he'd worked on for weeks. A thoughtful examination of how authority and respect intersected. How officers could earn the latter while appropriately exercising the former. Not abstract theory, but practical wisdom drawn from his military career and life experience. The next morning dawned clear and cold. James dressed with his usual care, suit, tie, veteran's pins on his lapel. Michelle had suggested he wear his uniform for the training, but again he had declined. This wasn't about rank or intimidation. It was about connection, about shared humanity. The police department's training facility was housed in a converted warehouse on the edge of town. When James arrived, Thomas and Anthony were already there, setting up the presentation materials and arranging the seating. Chief Martinez greeted him at the door. "Full house today," she said, gesturing to the room behind her where officers in various uniforms were finding seats. "Not just our department. We've got representatives from 3 neighboring towns." James nodded, pleased but also feeling a flutter of nervousness. It had been years since he'd addressed such a large group. "Carlos coming?" he asked, referring to her brother. "Front row," she confirmed with a smile. "Wouldn't miss it." The training began with Chief Martinez introducing the new initiative and its origins, a frank acknowledgement of past failures and a commitment to improvement. She spoke about the Parker incident directly, using it as a case study in how quickly trust could be broken and how painstakingly it had to be rebuilt. When it was James's turn to speak, he moved to the front of the room slowly, taking in the faces before him. Young officers at the beginning of their careers, veterans of the force with decades of experience, department heads curious about this new approach. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "My name is James Wilson. I'm a retired Army colonel, a Vietnam and Gulf War veteran and a resident of this community for over 20 years. 3 months ago, I was pulled over by an officer of this department and treated with disrespect and suspicion because of the color of my skin." A ripple of discomfort moved through the audience, but James continued steadily. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame. I'm here because what happened to me, what has happened to countless others in communities across this country, doesn't have to be the end of the story. For the next hour, James spoke about his experiences both in the military and as a black man in America. He talked about leadership, about the delicate balance between authority and empathy. He shared stories of commanders who had earned his loyalty and those who had demanded it, and the vastly different results each approach had yielded. Thomas and two other veterans followed, speaking candidly about how their PTSD affected their interactions with authority figures, offering practical suggestions for de-escalation. Officers asked questions, some defensive at first but gradually more open and engaged. By the lunch break, the atmosphere in the room had transformed from wary attention to genuine dialogue. James found himself surrounded by officers wanting to continue the conversation, sharing their own perspectives and challenges. As the day's session wound down, Chief Martinez invited James to offer closing thoughts. "When I was a young lieutenant," he told the group, "a wise sergeant major gave me advice I've never forgotten. He said, leadership isn't about making people do what you want. It's about becoming someone they want to follow. The same is true of policing. Authority comes with the badge, but respect is earned in every interaction, every decision, every moment of connection." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many officers as he could. "What happened to me 3 months ago could have ended with anger and division. Instead, we chose a different path. We chose to learn from each other, to build something better together. That choice is available to each of you every day with every person you encounter." As the officers filed out, many stopped to shake his hand or share a word of thanks. Carlos Martinez, the chief's brother, approached last. "Colonel Wilson," he said, extending his hand. "You probably don't remember me, but—" "Kuwait City, 1991, James interrupted with a smile. "Your sister reminded me. How are those bridges you're building?" Carlos laughed in surprise. "Standing strong, much like what you're building here." After everyone had left, James gathered his materials slowly, feeling the pleasant fatigue that comes from meaningful work. Chief Martinez approached with a cup of coffee. "So," she said, "same time next month for the follow-up session?" James nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I'll be here." As they walked to the parking lot together, snow beginning to fall again, Martinez asked, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if Parker had known who you were that day? If he'd recognized your name or rank?" James considered the question. "He might have treated me differently," he acknowledged. "But someone else would have received the same treatment instead. And we wouldn't be here now doing this work." She nodded thoughtfully. "From hardship, growth." "From hardship, growth," James repeated, looking up at the snow falling from the darkening sky. "And from growth, hope." They reached his car, and Martinez extended her hand. "Thank you, Colonel. Not just for today, but for everything these past months, for choosing to build rather than burn." James shook her hand firmly. "The work is just beginning," he reminded her. "Yes," she agreed with a smile. "But we've laid a good foundation." As James drove home through the snowy streets, he thought about all that had transpired since that October afternoon when Officer Parker had pulled him over. The humiliation and anger, the unexpected allies, the community that had rallied around not just him, but the idea that things could be better. That change was possible. He thought about Parker somewhere in Ohio, hopefully finding his own path to growth and understanding. He thought about Thomas Walker, transformed by adversity into an advocate and leader. He thought about the officers he'd spoken to today, some resistant, some receptive, all part of the ongoing story. His phone rang through the car speakers. It was Michelle. "How did it go, Dad?" she asked eagerly. James smiled, watching the snow fall in the glow of his headlights. "It went well," he told her.
Very well indeed.
"I think this is just the beginning."